Hi, everyone. This is Joey Lindstrom with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thanks for joining our webinar today. Looks like we've got about 25 people on so far. I'm going to give it 2 minutes before we get started. First, to give people a couple more minutes to log on, but then also because I'm having a little bit of difficulty with my Microsoft PowerPoint right now. So I think we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. And if anyone would be so kind, you'll notice there's a questions box at the right-hand side of your screen. If anyone would pop into the question box with a confirmation that they can hear me right now through the audio, that would be really helpful because, of course, I'm doing this from home. Okay, a couple people did, and it looks like we're good. So as I mentioned, we're going to give it just a couple of minutes, and then we will get started. Thank you so much for your patience. Hello, everybody. This is Joey Lindstrom at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I want to thank everyone for your patience. We are going to get started now. As I mentioned, I did have some trouble with my Microsoft PowerPoint, but I think that's all worked out. And giving it a couple minutes before we started allowed us to build up our audience. So it looks like I have now shared my screen, and that is, according to the audience view feature on my control panel, working. And several of you shared earlier that you could hear me. So my great fears about what might happen doing this from my home seem to be overblown. I think we're ready to get started and rock and roll. So today, as you know, through our email and through our website, we're continuing the Our Homes, Our Votes 2020 skills training and discussion on how state and local organizations who work on housing advocacy can effectively engage in the upcoming election. I'd like to start with just some general logistics. We will allow time today at the end of the webinar for questions, and we have about 40 people on the line, so it might actually work to unmute people who have questions. So feel free to raise your hand. You can also put your question in the questions queue at the right-hand side of your screen. The questions queue should be at the bottom of your control panel there. We are going to provide access to both a video recording and a copy of today's slides to all participants. We try to do that the following day after the presentation. I think the last couple of months we did it the following week, but we'll do that within a couple of days. So you will have access to a recording. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, shoot an email to Brooke Shipwright on the field team. That's Brooke's email address right there. She's helping me out today with technical questions, and she's also monitoring the questions box. So any questions that you have, feel free to shoot them to Brooke. All right. And so today's agenda is simple. We're going to do an introduction of the Our Homes, Our Votes project. That's a quick introduction that I go through at all of these webinars just to provide people with some context of what we're working on and how we hope it will make an impact. Then I'll share just a few ideas about COVID-19 and the elections. Of course, we've all been sheltering in place for so long at this point, and that has a real impact on the elections that have happened for the primaries and the presidential primaries. It'll also have a real impact for what we can expect to see in the elections in November. But the meat of our agenda today is on educating voters. How to vote, the rights of voters, and candidate positions are the things that we'll be going into. Now, many of you know that education is a key piece of the Our Homes, Our Votes strategy, but education is not just educating voters, it's also educating candidates about housing issues and what their positions should be on housing issues. If your organization is interested in effectively and actively engaging with candidates during this election, we really encourage you to do so. And we covered a lot of the key strategies for doing that in our previous webinar from last month, in which we had Eric Huffnagel from Michigan Coalition for the Against Homelessness and Joan Service from Arizona Housing Coalition share some thoughts about town hall meetings, candidate forums, questionnaires, and other engagement. So I really encourage you all to check out that that recording that we have on the ourhomes-ourvotes.org website. For today, we'll be talking about education specifically as it relates to voters. Presenters, today is just going to be yours truly, flying solo, a little bit like we did in December. I think it won't be too surprising to you that so many people in our field and in our network are singularly focused right now on responding to the coronavirus and COVID-19, and of course that makes a lot of sense. That is the tremendously prevalent focus of our work at NLIHC as well. But of course, the election in November will happen, and we need to make sure that low-income renters are represented at the polls. So let's talk about Our Homes, Our Votes. On this slide is encapsulated with one of my favorite little slogans, which is I am a renter and I vote. And that really is at the core of what we're trying to do with this project, where we hope that we can engage housing organizations throughout the country, whether advocacy organizations, housing providers, or resident associations and resident leaders themselves, to increase voter turnout and voter registration rates amongst low-income housing residents and their allies. We do this because we see a big disparity in rent between renters and homeowners in how they participate in national elections. So these are voter turnout rates from 2008 to 2016. And as you'll see, there's a big gap between the way renters and homeowners participate. And it won't then be a surprise to any of you that there is a disparity in the policies that are created by elected officials. They naturally favor homeownership over rental housing with subsidy resources and with the rights of people as they interact with their own homes and have privacy and have the rights afforded to them in court of law to maintain their habitability and not be displaced. That disparity is even greater when you look at it not by renter versus homeowner, but by low income versus high income. The categories we have here are households who are under $20,000 and households who are over $100,000. And you'll see there's an extraordinary disparity in voter registration and voter turnout. This is, we believe, why policymakers aren't focusing on solutions to homelessness. But voters very much do care about solutions to homelessness. 83% of the public agrees that elected officials are not paying attention to the cost of housing, or not paying enough attention. And 76% say they are more likely to vote for a candidate that has a detailed plan for making housing more affordable. So this recap really sets the stage for how we've been engaging the Our Homes, Our Votes 2020 effort, and how we continue to work to provide tools for advocates like yourselves throughout the country. I want to do a quick note about coronavirus and the elections. This is similar to what I chatted about last week, and I've added a couple of details as well. Or excuse me, I said last week, I meant last month during our March webinar for Our Homes, Our Votes. So first, there's a call to action around COVID-19, and the call to action is on the need for additional resources to mitigate harm from the COVID-19 pandemic. This was something that we worked on tremendously in the lead up to the CARES Act, and many of you know we won through our collective advocacy throughout the country $12 billion in new resources for housing programs and programs to benefit people who are homeless. But we know that this is not nearly enough. What we are engaging on for a fourth bill and a next spending bill for coronavirus is additional resources highlighted by $100 billion in emergency rent assistance, and additional $11.5 billion in emergency solution grants, ESG funding. And if you're looking at the slide, yes, it says 11.5 bill. It should say billion. That'll be corrected when we send out the slides after this. And maybe we'll even edit it out of this recording, depending on how amusing it all is. And then finally, we want a national moratorium on all evictions. Now, this final ask might seem odd or confusing to some of you because you may have heard that there is a moratorium on evictions in the CARES Act that passed at the end of March. The fact of the matter is that moratorium on evictions applies only to properties that have federal housing funding or have mortgages that are backed by Fannie, Freddie, or FHA mortgages. And this is not the 100% of the universe of rental housing in the United States. And it's actually very confusing for many renters in this moment to determine if they live in a property that is covered by the current eviction moratorium established by the CARES Act. So we're looking for something that is comprehensive, that is widespread, that applies to all rental housing throughout the country. So coronavirus and the election, many states are rescheduling or canceling their presidential primaries. Many of you saw the news last week that Wisconsin actually held their election despite social distancing guidelines. And this was a deliberate effort by some in state government to try to have an election with a very low voter turnout because there were elected leaders who were seeing potential benefit to low voter turnout. Wisconsin is the only state that has held an election in April or will hold an election in April. Many states delayed their elections to June. This will be important for many local elections that are taking place. It will no longer have as much importance for the presidential election. As you all saw, I'm sure Bernie Sanders has suspended his campaign for president. And so we thank Senator Sanders for his leadership on housing issues as a senator and a great housing plan as a candidate. But it looks now that former Vice President Joe Biden will be, excuse me, will be the Democratic nominee for president to run against President Trump in November. As many of you know, we tracked the presidential elections very closely, and we have information about all of the presidential candidates and their housing plans on our website at ourhomes-ourvotes.org, and that includes Vice President Biden's housing plan as well. I included on this slide something I included last month as well, which is that the ACLU has a great resource online for how individuals can request absentee ballots and promote voting by mail in their state. There is a very large effort right now throughout the country to expand absentee balloting and no excuse vote by mail, excuse me. and excuse me, the ACLU has a great resource on that. We're also encouraging those of you who are planning voter education events to use your website and to do online voter education as much as you can, especially as that occurs in the summer and early summer. As we know, social distancing will still be highly recommended and required in most places. Whether or not the requirements for social distancing ease up at the end of summer or early autumn, I think is still a speculative question and nobody knows for sure. And that really matters to those of you who are planning voter education efforts in your communities. As a result of this, it's important to think about what can be done through printed materials in the mail, through your blogs, your Facebook pages, and other social media presence, and how you can get your information to your audience without gathering them in one place. So that makes today's presentation a little bit different than it otherwise would be, because we talk about voter engagement very often as a face-to-face activity, and that really matters, especially in low-income communities. So we have to be creative in 2020, especially in the coming months, to start planning on how we will engage voters without actually being face-to-face, because it looks like we're going to have to do more of that than any of us necessarily planned for this year. So let's talk about educating voters, and so let's start with the most simple part of voter education, which is knowing how to vote. Most people who say that they didn't vote and are asked why will say that they didn't know how to vote. They didn't know that there was an election. So even though you might exist in a space where the election is something you're thinking about very actively, it's always on your mind, it's important to remember that people in your community might be thinking about it very little. Indeed, people in low-income communities are often focused on more narrow matters of acquiring what they need to survive and to help out their family and loved ones to survive, and they don't have time to think about all of the policy decisions that the rest of us are engaging on as advocates. Sometimes the really basic information still needs to get out there. And when I say the basic information, I'm saying the election date, where are the polls? When are the polls open? What do voters need to bring with them? And what are their options for mail-in ballots and early voting? Election dates and times are a really simple piece of information that you can put on your website, in your social media, in all of your newsletters and materials. And it's something that you should really be focusing on, getting that information out there right now so that people have an understanding of when the election is and that they understand when they can show up at the polls. Disinformation campaigns in terms of election dates and polling times and polling locations are tragically very common. I remember when I was starting my career in Wisconsin, there was a really pernicious effort in Milwaukee where flyers were distributed encouraging people to vote on Wednesday, the day after the election, and so forth. This is tragically really common. And so establishing in the minds of voters in our communities and in our networks and constituencies the actual dates of the election and what they need to know about being in their polling location by the time it closes is extremely important. So the good news is there are a lot of really wonderful resources that give you this information. So I'm pointing you to Nonprofit Vote, which has a voting in your state resource, and League of Women Voters, which has a really great address-based voter information tool at vote411.org. But I'm also delighted to say that through the great work of May on our communications team at NLIHC, ourhomes-ourvotes.org is going to be in the very near future looking very different as we transition away from the presidential primary engagement and more toward prepping for the election. And we have built out, inspired by Nonprofit Vote and League of Women Voters, state-based pages that will look similar to what they have. So those pages will be going live in the coming days. What I'm going to show you right now is some examples that you would see at Nonprofit Vote or League of Women Voters. And again, you can find similar pages to what I'm about to show you on ourhomes-ourvotes.org in the coming days. But for right now, let's take a look at what we have for voting in your state at Nonprofit Vote. It looks like this has voting in Wisconsin, shares information on how to register to vote. registering to vote online where that's possible, election day registration where that's possible. And you can see there's also information on the left about some special circumstances. So what if you are an ex-offender and you have a criminal history? What if you are a person who is homeless and you don't have an address? What if you are voting but you don't want your address to be searchable on the voter rolls because you're a victim of domestic violence, right? These are all special circumstances that can be found on the voting in your state page. And this is an example of what that looks like. This is the nonprofit vote example, but highlighting again, ourhomes-ourvotes.org will be having this functionality again as well. So we know how to give people information about when and where to vote. We know how to find the information on what they need to bring with them. But some people who have never voted before and find the process rather intimidating or perhaps even confusing. So some people will want to know how to complete the ballot, what are the positions that will be on the ballot, and what are the ballot initiatives, right? So if you've never voted before and you don't know if it's something that you do by filling out bubbles on a form, or if it's something you do with a computer touchscreen, sometimes what can be really valuable, especially in low-income communities, is to partner with the local election officials, the county clerk or the board of elections, and provide a demonstration of here's how the voting machine works, or here's how the voting form will look. Here's what the line will look like. It helps people to visualize what their experience will be like at the polling locations. Another really effective way to get information to people who have never voted before is by providing them with a sample ballot. And a sample ballot should look like exactly what they're going to see when they show up on election day. It contains all of the questions and all of the candidates, as well as all of the positions. And this provides an opportunity for you as an organizer to explain what those positions are and why they matter, to explain why voting for municipal judge might be really important as it pertains to eviction court. It might be an opportunity to explain why the state legislature is extremely important because they establish priorities for spending affordable housing resources that come from the federal government. Providing information to new voters about what positions matter, help them to be informed voters beyond just elections like governor or president, where there are a lot of headlines and a lot of discussion. The down ballot races really matter. And when we encourage low-income people to show up to the polls, it's not just because we care about the presidential race, we care about all of the races, and giving them information about what positions do what can be really important. If you live in a state where ballot initiatives are allowed, then it's really helpful to be able to provide a breakdown of all the questions that voters will be asked as direct legislation. This is especially important in California, where sometimes there can be, upwards of 20 or 30 ballot questions that people have to answer, and getting that information on election day when you show up can be pretty overwhelming. Providing that to voters in advance through sample ballots is extremely important. I'll remind you now that many of you are participating as nonprofit 501c3 organizations. And of course, as a 501c3 organization, you can't be aligned with any candidate or any party, but you can have specific positions on ballot initiatives as long as those ballot initiatives relate to the mission of your organization. So you can find sample ballots and some information through the vote411.org tool, right? And when you go into Vote 411, as you can see on the left-hand side, you can put in your address, street, city, state, and zip code. And so I put in an address that used to be mine when I lived in Madison, Wisconsin, like 15 years ago. And then it shows on the right-hand side some different topics that you could select. But if you enter your address, what it brings you to next is some information about the candidates and the ballot measure information. And it also gives you on the left the election date, the registration deadlines, and how you can vote by mail in upcoming elections and so forth. In addition, you can get a personalized ballot. Learn where candidates running for office in your community stand on the issues. You can print or email information to use as a reference and so forth. And this can stand then as a voter guide that you can distribute to people in your communities and neighborhoods. This ballot includes, as you can see, examples of all the different positions that are going to be considered. And then it shows all of the different candidates for that position and allows voters and people using the website to click on them and to get more information. Further information from vote411.org includes upcoming debates and forums and so forth. That obviously will be something that won't be populated until later, until after all of the social distancing has been eased off, if we get to that point. And so I just really want to emphasize when it comes to voter guides, I shared some really helpful info here from the League of Women Voters. And most of you will not have the capacity or staff time or funding to put together extensive voting guides of your own that go deeper than just how to vote and what positions are we voting for, what ballot initiatives will be on the ballot, but to actually dig deeper into who are the candidates and what are their positions. If you'd like to distribute information about candidates and their positions, I do again refer you to the webinar we did in March, which was about getting candidates on the record and included some really helpful examples and information about successful candidate questionnaire activities. If that's something that you don't want to do or you don't feel you have capacity to do, one thing I would encourage you to consider is connecting with the League of Women Voters in your community. We had Maggie Bush from the League of Women Voters on our webinar back in December, I believe it was, and she provided a lot of really great information about their online resources, but also encouraged advocates to connect with local leagues, because sometimes rather than putting together your own voter guide, you can perhaps add information to a voter guide that the League of Women Voters is doing, or add a question to a questionnaire that they're sending out anyway. This can make your engagement more of a team effort and can make it easy for you to produce the final materials that you're distributing to people. So that's something that I really strongly encourage everyone to keep in mind as they think about the best ways to put together voter guides and move forward with candidate engagement. So I want to then transition, just talk for a minute about a hypothesis around voter disengagement and sort of why it happens, and something that we confront as we're educating voters, which is that so many people look at the challenges that are being that are growing in their communities and feel a sense of apathy, and they don't connect voting to actual change. And we want to always connect to people that voting is just one step in an overall civic engagement plan and process, and that people should consider voting as the first thing they do to make their community better, but not the only thing that they do to make their community better. I'm going to transition our conversation now to talking a little bit about how we can educate voters to defend them and prepare them to defend themselves against voter suppression. But before I do so, I want to just throw it open and see if there are any questions in the questions box at this point. Brooke, are you there? Are we seeing any questions so far?
Hey Joey, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, great. There's just one question about how to address tips for addressing voter apathy during COVID-19.
So I think COVID-19 actually provides us with a really great opportunity to change our voter messaging. And I think we're all sort of realizing this right now, which is COVID-19 and the ongoing crisis demonstrates how vulnerable our communities are, and that we are really imperiled if we aren't building the necessary supports and protections in advance of a crisis, right? We see that the countries who are managing this crisis the best are those that have strong institutions and better income equality in their communities and so forth, better access to healthcare, and better institutions to provide consistent information so that communities can engage in the crisis together. Now, that's kind of a lot of jargon. The way I would say this if I was knocking on a voter's door is I would say, look at what's going on right now through coronavirus. We know that a lot of what's happening is happening because we didn't get ready for it, and it's happening because the elected leaders were ignoring low-income people. when we look at the racial disparities in who's dying from this virus, when we look at the income disparities of who's being laid off and who's going to face losing their livelihoods because of this virus, we know that it's because of the lack of preparation from our leaders who weren't focusing on low income communities, right? And so one thing that we talked about in our webinar on December when we really got into messaging was the most effective messaging to voters always focuses on the future. It always focuses on change and the duty of each individual voter to structure a better future for their community, their neighborhood, and their household. What we see right now is a really bleak present that allows us to talk about the importance of thinking forward rather than just reacting to a crisis when it happens. So that's my thinking on messaging right now. Definitely use the current challenges to talk about the importance of future planning and the importance of investment in vulnerable communities. And yeah, I think that's how I would answer that for now. Brooke, do we have any other questions coming in?
There is one question, excuse me, about scorecards. Does NLIHC or any other affordable housing advocacy organization maintain a scorecard of voting records of sitting senators and U.S. House representatives?
Okay, so
an example is like a voting record on supporting affordable housing.
Yeah, so we don't do that, and we've had conversations over the years of if we should do it and how we would do it and so forth. It is so one thing that I very often say is, look, it's very appropriate for nonprofit organizations to engage in elections and to engage with candidates as long as they do so without ever showing favoritism to a candidate. Voter scorecards are a particularly difficult thing to do in a nonpartisan manner, right? So if I give one candidate the grade of an A and I give another candidate the grade of a C, am I indicating that I prefer one candidate over the other? I certainly am. But can I do that in a way that is not about the candidate, but only about the issue? Perhaps. But this gets really quickly really fraught in that when we judge a candidate, will we judge them based on the pieces of legislation they voted for or the pieces of legislation that they introduced? Mick Mulvaney, who many of you know as a leader in the Trump administration for many years, when he was in Congress, he would frequently, or at least a couple of times, do these tricky things where he would propose a massive expansion of the National Housing Trust Fund, which is great. And within the legislation or within the proposal, he would say, we're going to massively expand the National Housing Trust Fund and then cut all of these various other HUD programs, right? So if he was being graded on his commitment to the Housing Trust Fund and block grant programs to produce new housing, that would be an excellent grade. If he was being graded on will he protect HUD programs, that would be a very bad grade. And just in how you select which things are and are not included in the final score can sort of produce an impact, an outcome that shows favoritism, right? So it would not be hard, for example, for a housing organization to set up its criteria for a scorecard whereby a lot of people who you don't think of as housing champions might come out very strongly, right? So it's not something that we've done before. It's something that we've talked about. It's something that we feel like would be very effective, but would probably have to be done not by a 501c3 like us, but by a political action committee or possibly a 527 group and so forth, because it's something that's really difficult to do as a 501c3 organization like we are. So that's my answer to that question. Brooke, do we have any other questions coming in?
Thanks, Joey. No more questions at this time.
Okay, and it doesn't look like we have anybody with their hands raised at this point. So I think, oh, actually, John Dete, I've got your hand raised. Let me see if I can unmute you for a question. John, are you there? Did that unmuting perhaps not work? All right. Well, John, feel free to raise your hand again, and we can try to come back to you because it looks like you hit the hand raise button. We will do questions again a little bit further down in this presentation. All right. So getting into voter suppression, which I think many of you know is a very significant and growing aspect of engaging on elections, because a lot of how certain candidates are winning and certain parties are engaging is by driving down the number of voters. And this happens in a lot of different ways that specifically target the communities that we all work in. So first, let's talk about, oh, there we go. Defending against voter suppression. The first thing you need to do is provide information on voter ID requirements. I just showed you on the nonprofit vote page, voting in your state, there's a button you can hit for ID requirements in your given state. And honestly, I encourage you to check out a website to get this information. We're going to put it on our information or on our website, ourhomes-ourvotes.org. Voter ID laws have been changed a lot since voter ID became a big push of the Republican Party in 2006. Some of these voter ID laws have been successfully challenged through a court process. Some have not. Some have sort of changed back and forth over the last 15 years. So I definitely encourage you to get the best, most up-to-date information about voter ID requirements in your state. The second thing that we can do to educate voters to protect them against voter suppression is to make sure that they know that everyone who shows up at the polls fills out a ballot, right? If someone shows up and they're told that they went to the wrong polling location, or they are told they can't vote because they're not listed on the voter rolls, or they are told they can't vote because someone's challenging them and saying that they voted already at another polling location, right? There are a lot of different ways that people will try to intimidate voters by challenging them at the polling location. If poll workers are declining to provide a ballot to a given voter, it's important to have voters know that they can always fill out a provisional ballot that won't be counted on that night, but would probably or possibly be counted after a review if there is ever a recount. Those of you who have been following elections in the United States over the past several decades have noticed there have been quite a lot of close races with quite a lot of recounts. So casting a provisional ballot is always important and something people should always do. People should use the election protection hotline. It's shown here on the slide as 866-R-VOTE or 888-BEI-VOTA. U.S. Department of Justice Voting Rights Hotline is there as well. These are attorneys who are available on election day and in the days leading up to the election, who can handle questions that arise for voter intimidation and voter suppression efforts, and will give voters the information that they need to successfully engage and make sure that they get to cast a ballot on election day. The best defense is a good offense. When we make sure people have the information that they need about their rights as voters, we can prevent them from getting turned away at the polls on election day. So we've talked a little bit about voter guides, how to vote. We've talked a little bit about voter suppression. Let's talk about informing voters on the issues. As I mentioned earlier when I was showing you the League of Women Voters concept, I talked a little bit about a voter guide, which often can be a single document, or if you're doing it online, can be a series of pages that provides voters with some general information, some information about ballot initiatives, and then also general information about candidates, such as name, photo, occupation, party affiliation, where to go for more info on their website, and so forth. It can also include responses the candidates gave from a questionnaire. Of course, you can't coordinate with a candidate on including this information or not. What we suggest, and again, this is in last month's webinar, is reaching out to all candidates with a questionnaire and making sure, if you can, to print the full responses that they provide. If you are simply characterizing what a candidate said or restating it or rephrasing it, you can sometimes wander unintentionally into a gray area of legal consideration. It's best to send the questionnaires to the candidates themselves and ask them to provide answers that you can include in your voter guide. They are more likely to provide those answers if you indicate to them how widely distributed your voter guide will be and who the likely readership is. If they get a sense that they can get their vision and their policy positions in front of voters, they will respond to your questionnaire and they will help you produce a very informative voter guide. So survey responses, best candidate positions to include for your network are the ones that are provided from all the candidates. Picking and choosing can be partisan, and it's totally appropriate for you if you're providing websites to candidate web pages, if you're providing the links, or if you're providing candidate information. Just make sure that you include all candidates, right? So those are the key points that I really wanted to go over in terms of educating voters today. I'm interested to know if we have further questions, because in previous years when we did this webinar, we combined voter education with candidate education. As you can see today, we kind of split it up. We did candidates last month, and now we're doing voters this month, which is why it seems like we're ending a little bit early. But I'm also interested to know if there are other questions that we can answer and further engagement we can do, because it looks like we've got about 20 more minutes. So I'm looking for any raised hands that we might have. But in the meantime, Brooke, is there anything new in the questions box?
Yes, we do have one question. Voter roll-off or undervoting can be substantial for down ballot races, which can negatively impact local housing ballot measures. Do you have any insight on getting voters to fill out the entire ballot?
I really think the best practice is what I was sharing earlier, which is sample ballots. Making sure that voters get to see before election day what they will be asked to decide on, and that will inspire them to have conversations about those other positions. And even if they don't go into the very nitty-gritty details of all of the local offices, getting at least some general info about who the candidates are and some general information about what the position is will really empower them to cast more of those votes in down ballot races. You're absolutely right. You know, it's a real threat and vulnerability to low-income communities when people are only voting for positions at the top of the ballot. And that's why providing those sample ballots and information about what's on the ballot is extremely important. Like, this is something that we can fix by educating voters and making them feel like when they show up at the polls, they can do so with confidence and with knowledge, right? You know, so often our engagement in elections is register voters, get them to the polls. But we register a bunch of people and we drive them to the polls and they don't know what to do when they get there, right? And so this really substantive middle piece of educating voters is important. And as it relates to down ballot races, I really think it's extremely important to rely on sample ballots or including sample ballots with voter guides.
Great, thank you. We have one more in the questions box. Sorry if I missed this, but what should educating voters about presidential delegate selection look like at this point?
So that's an interesting question. When it comes to presidential candidate, like delegate selection and what happens in the presidential primary, if you're a 501c3 organization, I would tell you not to do that. I would advise you not to do that. Because primaries are, of course, by their very nature, a partisan process, right? So NLIHC was very engaged in the recent Democratic presidential primary, but engaged not to try to get people to vote in the presidential primary. We deeply believe in voter turnout, but we're not going to tell people to vote in, for example, the Iowa Democratic caucuses, because you can only do so if you are in fact a Democrat, right? But our engagement in the presidential primaries was mostly focused on educating the candidates about housing, to get them to talk about housing, to coordinate site visits that they would do at housing organizations and so forth. Because we wanted the candidates to be informed about the issue and to challenge one another to have the best positions on this issue. But as it related to the actual process of selecting which candidate gets the nomination, because that's a partisan process, our involvement was very minimal. Participating in nonpartisan local elections or participating in general elections is very, very easy. Register to vote, show up to vote. You don't have to tell people who to vote for. You don't have to advise them on who to vote for. You can do that in a way that is very nonpartisan. And we know that increasing voter turnout rates amongst low-income renters will absolutely advance the policy changes that we all know are very important. And we can do this, we can boost these turnout rates without being aligned with a particular political party. As it relates to delegate counts in a presidential primary, it strikes me as impossible to do that without participating in a partisan political process. So I think as it relates to educating voters about delegate counts in the presidential primary, it's not something that any 501c3 organization should do. If you are participating in today's webinar, but you are not from a 501c3 nonprofit and you're engaging as an individual, or you're engaging outside of the scope of nonprofit engagement, I think educating people about sort of delegate selection and the presidential primary and the upcoming convention can be really helpful because they're hearing about it a lot and they're thinking about it a lot. So I think that's something that I would probably address offline, and I will share my email address at the end of this presentation. So please feel free to reach out to me with more details on that if you're not doing nonpartisan engagement. But if you are doing nonpartisan engagement, don't get involved in the delegate count. Don't get involved in the conventions because that's a partisan process.
Joey, we have a few more questions coming in, but one follow-up to that question that you were just answering. Now that we have, it seems like one leading candidate for each party, should they be included in voter guides?
Yeah, I think that's very appropriate to include the candidates for each party. I think it's very appropriate to include them in voter guides for both. I think up until the conventions, you probably should use the word presumptive candidate, but I can't imagine anybody would get too rankled about referring to them as the nominees because they are in fact still presumptive until the conventions. There are some people who would say that including just the Democrat and Republican candidate is in fact a partisan act, because you are then ruling out the additional political parties like the Green Party or the Libertarian Party that exist and operate as significant third-party movements in the United States. To avoid any sort of questions or concerns about that, I think it's appropriate to put into any voter guide that our organization made a determination for presidential election that the only candidates we will highlight are those that are polling at least 10%, according to the most recent poll in whatever your newspaper is in your town. And you can sort of establish that threshold. And as long as you have a threshold that is reasonable, I think you can do that and be completely comfortable and so forth.
Great, thank you. The next question is someone who lives in an entirely vote by mail state. What tips would you have for people who live in those types of states?
First, I'll say congratulations on living in either Washington or Oregon. Well done. But honestly, my tips aren't that different. Vote by mail, you're still getting a ballot. That ballot might still be confusing, right? And instead of educating people on you need to be at your polling location at this address by this time, you need to instead be educating people on you need to have your ballot in the mail postmarked by this day. If you don't trust the Postal Service, here are some places where you can drop off your ballot. Or you can send volunteers not just to educate people about their ballots, but you can do the voter education after the ballots have gone out. And you can have ballot parties encouraging people to bring their ballots, walk them through a sample ballot, have a conversation about what are the positions on the ballot, have a conversation about the ballot initiatives. And when you do that, this is an opportunity to educate voters in the moment immediately preceding their completion of the ballot. And so in this case, your voter education is that much more powerful. And in fact, in a vote by mail state, whether it's an entirely vote by mail state like Washington or Oregon, or a state that just has widespread vote by mail like Colorado, what you can do is you can schedule presentations like the one we're doing right now. You can do a Zoom meeting where you encourage people who are volunteers at your community center or residents in your public housing properties to join in, and they can log in. You can walk them through the ballot. You can hold it up on your camera and sort of show people what's on the ballot and what they're deciding on, and then give them information about how to fill it out and let them know that those ballots can be collected and submitted at a certain time. So really, like, I still believe in the sample ballots. I still believe in the voter guides. I think those are excellent. You just don't need to focus on the logistics as much, and you can focus more heavily on making sure people have the information that they need to confidently fill out that ballot and get it in.
Great. The next question is about voter turnout and partnering. They're curious what you think about partnering with unions and others to drive folks to the polls in neighborhoods where there's been a low voting record.
So I have four answers to that question. Let's see how far okay. So my first answer is, hey, we're going to do a specific Get Out the Vote webinar in September. So we'll plan on joining that one. We're going to go really deep into some of these questions. The second thing I'll say is providing someone with a ride to the polls is always going to be legal. You can never give someone a benefit for voting. You certainly can't give them a benefit for voting for a candidate. You can't even give them a benefit for voting. So if you are with a residents association and you wanted to, at the end of election day, let's imagine social distancing is gone and we can all gather like normal human beings again. Let's imagine on election day, you want to have an election night party with free pizza and, you know, sodas and beer for the adults or whatever in the community room at our low-income housing tax credit housing facility, right? You can't, at an event like that, say you're only allowed in if you wear an I voted sticker, right? You really have to let in everybody, whether they voted or not. But that's related to incentives for voting. A ride to the polls is a tool that enables voting. That has value, but it's something that can absolutely be provided for free and won't be considered an incentive, right? Additionally, in places that do vote by mail or no excuse absentee balloting, but they don't provide postage on the ballot. I went through this working on a campaign recently in Montana just a couple of years ago, where a lot of people were voting by mail, but they didn't have stamps. It's completely legal to provide postage to enable someone to get their ballot to count and so forth. The problem in the question that was just asked is related to coordinating with unions. Generally, I think for voter engagement, you want to build a big team and you want to bring in as many organizations in your community as possible. You just need to be a little bit careful about coordinating with organizations that have a specific desired partisan outcome or a specific desired outcome as it relates to a candidate, right? So if you, for example, shared the names of 10 of your residents with an organization that was back at the Democratic Party now has data and information from you that was provided for free that they use to drive someone to the polls, but you then coordinated with a party or a campaign. So coordinating with labor unions, fully appropriate, unless that organization has specifically endorsed candidates. When that happens, you either want to not move forward with that partnership, or you want to talk with whatever attorney your nonprofit works with to make sure that they're comfortable before moving forward. And I should actually add to this, the Alliance for Justice has a really excellent Boulder advocacy campaign. They joined us for our September webinar on legal considerations for nonprofits. They have a hotline staffed with attorneys who answer some of these gray area questions when they come up. And I really encourage all of you to know about boulderadvocacy.org, where you can get answers to a lot of the legal questions. So yeah, definitely partner with organizations that have vans and buses, get people to the polls. That's excellent. Just be careful about any organization that has a specific partisan or candidate affiliated desired outcome.
Great. That's all the questions I'm seeing in the questions box.
What about people with hands raised? Do we have any of those? I think our group
I'm
is
not
small enough
seeing
for that.
any.
Okay. All right. So last call for questions or raised hands. I'll check in with Brooke one more time before we're done. Third Thursdays at 3 webinar and podcast series. Today we did educating voters, so you can't sign up for that one anymore. But next month, we're going to talk very deeply in housing issues and ballot initiatives. There were so many ballot initiatives that passed in 2018 on housing, and we're expecting there are going to be a lot more in 2020 as well. In June, we're going to talk about overcoming common obstacles. Some of those things I mentioned earlier about voting if you don't have an address, voting if you're a victim of domestic violence or you have a criminal history. We'll talk about the challenge of voting while homeless specifically in July, and then we'll get into the voter mobilization parts in August and September. In August, we'll talk about vote by mail and early voting. In September, we're going to get into protecting against voter intimidation. And actually, I said our Get Out the Vote webinar was September. That's actually going to be October, as you can see. And then we're going to finish by talking about holding candidates to their promises. Also, if you're willing and so inclined, NLIHC is a membership organization. A lot of the work that we do, including our work on voter engagement in Our Homes, Our Votes, relies on the support of our organization and organizational and individual members. Please consider becoming a member today. And I mentioned earlier that I would put my email address back up on the screen before we leave. And that email address is right there next to my lovely face. And that's also my phone number, which, as you might expect, is currently forwarding to my cell phone because I'm totally in my house right now. All right, so that's all I have. Brooke, any other questions pop up in the last minute or so?
We do have one last question
Excellent.
regarding using social media in voter education. What suggestions would you have for that?
Yeah, so I think it's really possible to do, and it's something that a lot of organizations have done creatively. I'll say this presentation, as I first conceptualized it, did not emphasize social media because so many of the communities that we work with are communities that sometimes suffer from technology deficits. They don't have as much access to the internet and so forth. They might not be using as much social media. So oftentimes, traditional engagement through door-to-door or through having events or through sending out paper newsletters can be really effective. But what we're seeing right now is not only is social media extraordinarily popular, it's also extraordinarily popular in low-income communities and even increasingly in older and older communities as smartphones become more prevalent. And it is surely true, though I'm not aware of any specific data, it's surely true that in isolation as a result of social distancing, more and more people are spending more and more time online. At these times, I think it's really important to think about the way you can set up events and presentations through streaming services, including Facebook Live. I think it's important to set up periodic meetings if you're in a residents association using tools like Zoom or GoToWebinar, where you can present information like this and open it up for questions and have a little bit more of a give and take and so forth. As it relates to things like Twitter, I think sometimes the best thing to do is promote information that exists out there on the internet. So if your state allows people to register to vote online, make sure people in your network are seeing your organization putting that out there through Twitter. Here's where you go to register to vote online. Here's where you go to request an absentee ballot. Here's what you need to know about election day and the primary election coming up in September, making sure that everything you produce, whether it's a voter guide or a candidate questionnaire or tips for making sure you have your voter ID in time, all of the information that you produce can be put on your website, can be put on your blog, and then you have a link that you can share through the entire universe of social media, Twitter and Facebook and what else are the kids using? MySpace? Just kidding. So yeah, you can use those links and really get them out there through social media tools. And I really encourage everyone to do so as much as possible. What we have on our website, ourhomes-ourvotes.org, is we have some interesting infographics. What we're going to discuss doing in the coming months is identifying some more visually engaging, shareable pieces that people can click on, and it gets them to the space on our website where they can learn about voting by mail or learn about registering to vote online and so forth. So I think of social media as best used to provide meetings and presentations remotely, to get information out through the sharing of links, through engaging people with visualized data and good images. And then finally, I think the best people at using social media are the ones who are creative about engaging people through challenges, right? This is a space where we can do a, you know, here are the people on my floor who are registered to vote, you know, like, and putting that out there and challenging people to add their names to the list, right? Or putting things out on social media, like I took the pledge to vote on election day, you know, here are 7 other people who I challenged to pledge to vote on election day, and to also post some video of themselves dumping ice on them, on themselves, or something funny like that. I think that's a really creative use of the internet that more and more people need to be thinking about, because one of the growing trends in campaigns is by engaging people not through campaign staff or campaign volunteers, but by identifying supporters and getting them to engage everyone who's in their network. Because the most effective engagement is through someone who you know, right? The most convincing people in your life are people who you actually know and have a relationship with. And so this relational organizing is the most prevalent emerging trend in campaigns. So to the extent that we can find our Twitter followers and get them to engage their Twitter followers, or get them to engage their Facebook friends and so forth, that's where we really start to see the ripple effect. Any other questions?
Nope, that's it.
Okay, well, we used up our full hour. I want to thank everybody again for joining us today. I want to thank you for being patient with me in those first 3 minutes as I was figuring out my PowerPoint situation. We will get a recording and a copy of these slides out to everyone on Monday of next week. And I hope you all have a great day. Stay safe, stay healthy, everyone. Bye.